right. Last class we talked about the end of the French Revolution and the person who officially declared it to be over, which was Napoleon Bonaparte. All right, so today we're going to be talking about this guy, Napoleon Bonaparte, and we have fill in the blank notes, your favorite kind here, so you don't have to write all that much. But as I've said before, be sure to watch this entire video, listen to the entire thing. Don't just skip ahead to where you can jot down all the words, because this way you will actually comprehend what you are writing down. All right, so Napoleon Bonaparte, he was born in 1769 on the Mediterranean island of Corsica. All right, Corsica is an island in the Mediterranean Sea, just off the coast of France. And he went to military school as a teenager. Okay? And here he really proved himself to be a very brilliant student of military history and tactics. He had just such a great mind for it. He really understood it, had great ideas about battlefield tactics, just a real genius when it came to all things military. And his greatest military heroes were Alexander the Great, who we have talked about, Hannibal, who we have not talked about, and also Charlemagne. Okay, so a lot of reasons he liked Alexander the Great. Remember how much territory he conquered in such a short period of time and at such a young age. Napoleon really looked up to Alexander because of those things. Hannibal goes back to the days of the Roman Empire. He actually crossed the Alps with a group of war elephants. Okay? He used elephants in battle, and at least for him, it was a really brilliant tactic. Okay? He conquered quite a bit of area, and he also really admired Charlemagne because he was kind of the father of France. He united Western Europe, and that was really seen as home for Napoleon. Now, most historians estimate that Napoleon was about 5'6". You probably heard that Napoleon was a really, really short guy. He was about 5'6", which is definitely shorter than average. Maybe not as short as you thought he was, but about 5'6". And this really bothered him his whole life. He was always kind of upset about how short he was, and kind of out to prove how he was tough and vicious, even though he was short. Even still today, if a guy is a little bit shorter, and he has like a big personality or an aggressive person, you might call that person, that might say they have a Napoleon complex, all right? So that's one term that's still used today, even though it was coined 200 years ago with Napoleon Bonaparte. Now, when the French Revolution broke out in 1789, Napoleon joined the army on the side of the new French government, all right? So he was a part of the French Revolution. And during his time in the French army, others began to really recognize him as pretty much a military genius. This guy is really young, but he understands military tactics and strategy. He gets it. And he really was one of the greatest military geniuses in the history of the world, really on par with legends like Alexander, as we talked about, and like Genghis Khan. Okay, ruthless people, yeah, conquered, killed millions, but at the same time, you can't deny how intelligent they were with regard to battle and war. Now, in October of 1795, this was a year after the end of the Reign of Terror, after the death of Maximilien Robespierre, a group of royalist rebels marched on the National Convention. We talked about the National Convention, and a group of royalist rebels who wanted the government to become monarchy again. They marched on the National Convention, and a government official told Napoleon, who was in the army at this time, he told him to defend the delegates of the Republic. Do not let these royalist rebels kill or harm any of these members of the delegation. So Napoleon and his men gunned down hundreds of invading royalists, just gunned them down with their cannons, and sent thousands running away. Really kind of surrounded them, bombarded them with fire. And he was seen throughout Paris as the savior of the French Republic, since he was able to so decisively defeat this group of rebels and preserve and save their military or their government leaders. All right, so people knew his name after this. This is what made him famous to begin with, when people started to know who Napoleon was. And he was promoted in the French army and went on to lead his army in military campaigns in places like Austria, Italy, Egypt. Now, Egypt actually, by 1798, he invaded Egypt just because that is what Alexander had done. Remember, Alexander the Great was one of his heroes. Alexander was one of the few people in Egypt in world history to be able to conquer Egypt, and Napoleon wanted to do that. So he invaded Egypt, even though it didn't really hold that much strategic importance. He wanted to be like Alexander. Now, by 1798, Napoleon had become really a hero in the eyes of the French people, someone who's going to bounce back France, make them back on top, kind of end this period of chaos and bring back some more strength and stability. And by 1799, the Directory, which we had talked about, these were the leaders of the French government. They had become very weak and had really lost the confidence of the French people. And a lot of people began to encourage Napoleon to take over the government. They're saying, hey, Napoleon is the guy that we need to lead us into the 19th century. He's the guy for us. He's strong, he's smart, he's pretty young. We want him to be our new leader. So in November of 1799, Napoleon surrounded his troops around the national legislature, the same national legislature, mind you, that he helped to protect 4 years earlier by gunning down the rebels. But he surrounded this legislature and drove out most of its members. He then dissolved the Directory, said it was not going to exist anymore, and he was appointed the first consul of France. Napoleon very quickly assumed the powers of a dictator after this. So another person to compare him to would probably be Julius Caesar. Remember, Julius Caesar was the consul of the Roman Republic, and then he very quickly became the emperor or the dictator of the Roman Empire. So that's kind of what Napoleon did as well. Now, when Napoleon seized power, he declared the French Revolution to be officially over 10 years after it had begun. He said, a new era has dawned for France. Okay, the French Revolution is over. The Napoleonic era has begun. So within just 4 years, Napoleon rose from just a relatively obscure position, kind of a nobody in the French army, to become literally the master of France, of the entire country. A very quick ascent to power. And at this point, Britain, Austria, and Russia became really nervous. Okay? They saw Napoleon as a tyrant. They saw him as someone who's really dangerous, who could plunge all of Europe into war and could usher in a new reign of conquest and terror across the continent. So they joined forces with one goal in mind, to remove Napoleon from power. So Napoleon waged war and diplomacy very effectively for the next 3 years. And by 1802, all three of these nations had signed peace treaties with France because of Napoleon's both diplomatic efforts and his military campaigns. So Europe was at peace now. For the first time in over a decade, Europe was finally at peace. The French Revolution's over, these other wars are over, and now Europe is at peace, which meant that now Napoleon could focus on restoring order and prosperity to France once again. Now that France is safe and the chaos is over, he can start governing his new country. So Napoleon's first goal in restoring France was to stabilize France's economy. Be sure you know that. That is what he focused on first, was the economy. He said, if we do not get money into people's pockets, we can kiss this new nation goodbye, all right? So he focused on the economy first, and the economy had pretty much been in a depression for over a decade with the revolution. He set up a very efficient method of tax collection, which is very important for any kind of federal government. Remember, that was one of the problems with the Articles of Confederation with the U.S., is that there wasn't an efficient method of tax collection. But here Napoleon set that up, and he also established a national banking system. He then removed all corrupt government officials and set up government-run public schools. Right? So you have all these new reforms being pushed through with Napoleon. Now, graduates from these schools were then appointed to public office on the basis of merit, on the basis of their skills, and if they were intelligent or qualified, instead of just appointing people because of family connections. Napoleon said that leads to corruption. We shouldn't appoint people based on who they know or who their dad is. We should appoint them based on them and whether or not they can do the job well. He also, with this new Enlightenment philosophy, also opened up France to religion again. Remember, the French Revolution was very much an atheistic revolution. Maximilien Robespierre did rid of all religion, okay, made France a completely secular country, and persecuted those who held on to their faith. And with this document called the Concordat that Napoleon signed, he agreed with Pope Pius VIII that the Catholic Church is very influential. All right, so he opened up France to the Catholic Church again, and really to all religion once again through this Concordat. And this recognized the influence of the church in France, but it also rejected church control in the government. So remember the Enlightenment idea that this built on separation of church and state. So Napoleon said, we're not going to be hostile to religion anymore. We're going to let the church into our country again, but at the same time, make sure the Pope knows that he is not going to run things in France. I am going to run things in France. All right, so very much separation of church and state. And this concordat made Napoleon popular both with the church because he let them in, and it also made him popular with the majority of the French people because the majority of the French people wanted to be religious again, but they also didn't want the church to control the government. So in many ways, these social reforms that Napoleon brought about are really more impressive and more praiseworthy than his military accomplishments because this really made people's lives better. Napoleon also established a comprehensive system of laws known as the Napoleonic Code, and this reestablished legal order in France. However, it wasn't perfect because it also limited and restricted some individual freedoms. For example, freedom of the press, freedom of the speech no longer existed in France because of the Napoleonic Code. However, it did bring more stability, more order to France. In 1804, Napoleon decided to make himself emperor of France. He said, being the chancellor or the consul of France, not quite enough. I want to be the emperor of the French. And the French voters supported him. They wanted him to be the emperor because they really, really liked him. So on December 2nd, 1804, Napoleon walked down the aisle of Notre Dame Cathedral in Paris during his coronation ceremony. And the Pope was waiting for him down there to crown him as the emperor of France. And what happened next is really important. Napoleon sat on his throne, took the crown from the Pope, and then placed it on his own head. Okay, now that is a power move right there. What he was doing is basically saying, hey, I am the only one who has the authority to crown me emperor. Not even the Pope has authority over me. I am the only one who is worthy to crown myself as emperor. Okay, so with this gesture, Napoleon really signaled that he was more powerful than the church or the Pope or anyone, people who had traditionally crowned the rulers of France and other countries in Europe. Okay, so this power move really symbolized the beginning of Napoleon's dictatorship. Okay, when he really became an authoritarian dictator was at this point in 1804. Once he became emperor, Napoleon was no longer content to simply be the master of France. All right, he wanted to be more than that. He wanted to control the rest of Europe. Okay, so thinking about this dictatorship, all right, that has now been established in France. All right, this is what France fought the French Revolution about. Okay, that picture of King Louis XVI really kind of symbolizes a lot of what the French did not like about Louis XVI. They wanted to take him down. They wanted to reestablish France as something else. All right, just look at that picture there, the decadent lifestyle that he lived, all of that money, all that wealth that went into everything that is painted in that picture there with Louis XVI. And meanwhile, while Louis XVI was living like this, the French were starving and being charged very high taxes. So that's a big reason why the French Revolution was fought. Okay, so the French Revolution's fought, hundreds of thousands of people die, and then 10 years later, they get Napoleon. Now tell me, what exactly is the difference in those two pictures there? Nothing. Okay, there's really no difference at all. France traded one absolute monarchy for another absolute monarchy when it was all said and done. All right, so that's one reason why you see, the French Revolution didn't really accomplish much at all. Okay, so whenever Napoleon became emperor, as I said, he did not just want to control all of France; he wanted to control the rest of Europe. He then annexed the Austrian Netherlands and parts of Italy, and then looked to expand his dominion even further. Now, one nation that was very fearful of his ambitions was Britain. Okay, and the British persuaded Russia, Austria, and Sweden to join them against the French. All right, they said, hey, we need to put a stop to this guy. We thought he was going to be okay, but he has become the emperor of France. We do not want him to start taking over territory again. So in a series of very brilliantly well-fought battles, Napoleon crushed the opposition. His strategic moves were very unpredictable. That's one thing he was really good at. No one knew what he was going to do next, and it was very costly to his enemies because of that. So Napoleon's continued battlefield victories forced the rulers of Austria, Prussia, and Russia to sign peace treaties with him. Napoleon went on to build one of the largest European empires since ancient Rome. In fact, the largest European empire since ancient Rome. All right, so the largest European empire in 1,300 years is what Napoleon built with his military conquest. He expanded the borders of France. He conquered Spain. He conquered Italy. And then he conquered modern day Germany and Poland. This is a huge chunk of Europe here. Napoleon then looked to conquer his archenemy, Great Britain. He said, that is my next prize, that is my next trophy. I'm going to invade England and conquer them. So in 1805, the British Navy and the French Navy fought the Battle of Trafalgar. Very important battle here, because while France was the dominant land power, they were the most strong land power in Europe. Okay, no one could really defeat them on land. On the sea, the British were the most dominant. Okay, the British were the most dominant sea power in the world. Their navy was spectacular. And Napoleon's navy was defeated in this battle off the coast of Spain by a guy named Horatio Nelson. Important name. He was the guy who defeated Napoleon first. This is Napoleon's first defeat. But Napoleon did not let this stop him. He kept going. And in 1806, he conquered the Holy Roman Empire. Now think about this. The Holy Roman Empire has been around since the time of Charlemagne. Okay, we talked about Charlemagne in early September. The Holy Roman Empire had been around for over 1,000 years, and it was then conquered by Napoleon. Think about how many wars had been fought in that region, yet it wasn't until Napoleon that the Holy Roman Empire was able to be subdued. It then became the Confederation of the Rhine. That's what it was called then. By 1812, Napoleon had gained control over most of Europe. He wasn't able to conquer Britain, but he did conquer most of Europe, and the French Empire was absolutely enormous. However, even though it was enormous, it was also unstable. Okay, remember how unstable the Roman Empire became whenever it grew too large. That was one of the reasons why the Roman Empire fell, because they couldn't govern that much territory. So Napoleon was only able to maintain it at its greatest height, at its greatest extent, for about 5 years. From 1807 to 1812, that is when Napoleon had the most power, the most land in Europe. But then after those 5 years, it quickly fell to pieces, starting in 1812. So in 1812, Napoleon and his huge army invaded Russia. Big, big mistake. Okay, do not invade Russia, especially in the winter, and that is what Napoleon did. He invaded Russia in the winter, and he actually made it as far as Moscow. Some people said, wow, is Russia actually going to fall at the hands of this guy Napoleon? But then Russian winter set in. Okay, thousands of French troops died because they were not prepared for the cold, did not have the same acclimation that the Russian soldiers did. They also did not have the equipment, did not have the clothes to stay warm in that temperature. So thousands of French troops died, and then they were forced to retreat back into France. Now, Napoleon would not be the last European dictator to invade Russia in the winter. As we'll learn about in February, Adolf Hitler did the exact same thing. Did not learn from Napoleon's mistake, did not learn from history. But at this point, Napoleon's once massive empire began to fall apart. This was the first domino to fall, you could say. It was when he failed at the invasion of Russia. Okay, so it began to quickly fall apart. And in 1813, the Sixth Coalition, which was every European country surrounding Napoleon, they declared war on him because he had gotten way too powerful. Okay, he had become a tyrant and become far too powerful. They defeated his army at Leipzig and caused him to retreat back to France. And in March of 1814, the Sixth Coalition moved in on Napoleon and captured Paris, where he lived. Napoleon reluctantly abdicated his throne. Finally, after so many years of being really on top of the world, he abdicated his throne. He gave up his throne because he was surrounded by the army of the Sixth Coalition. So things that were going so well for him in 1812. By 1814, it had all crumbled to where he only controlled Paris, and then Paris was surrounded by the Sixth Coalition. So he gave up his throne with the Treaty of Fontainebleau, and he was then exiled to the island of Elba. in the Mediterranean Sea. Okay, the Sixth Coalition said we need to exile him. We can't have him stay in France because then he will try to gain power again. We need to exile him. That way he does not try to seize power. So from November of 1814 until June of 1815, the Congress of Vienna met. And this was a group of European leaders. And the goal of this 8-month meeting, there were really three major goals here. Okay, very important here, the three major goals of the Congress of Vienna. First was to redraw the boundaries of countries in Europe. Okay, with Napoleon's conquest, he had completely messed up all of the borders of the countries in Europe, and the Congress of Vienna said we need to redraw the European map so that we know which countries are which, and we know that they're not under the control of France anymore. The second goal of the Congress of Vienna was to settle issues that had arose during the French Revolution and had continued throughout the Napoleonic Wars. And third was to provide a long-term peace plan in Europe. They did not want a tyrant like this to rise to power again and ravage Europe with conquest. So they said, how can we provide a long-term peace plan in Europe? So the Congress of Vienna restored the boundaries of countries to where they had been before the Napoleonic Wars. All right, so where the boundaries had been before that time. And the Congress also resized a lot of major powers so they could kind of balance each other out, and so there wouldn't be another Napoleon. But then in 1815, when everything in Europe was thought to be finally back to normal, okay, we can go back to our normal lives after these terrible couple of decades of chaos, especially in France, but really throughout Europe, people thought, okay, now we can settle in. But then Napoleon escaped. He escaped the island of Elba and he returned to France. Okay, when he did this, he quickly regained control of the country because people still loved him because they were powerful under him, and he organized another army. He and his army then marched north to Belgium with the intention of restoring his empire to what it had been 3 years earlier. He said, okay, there's a slight hiccup, but I'm coming back. Okay, I'm going to make our empire into what it was before we tried to invade Russia. So he started with Belgium, but the British, the Dutch, and the Prussians were not going to let that happen. When they heard that Napoleon had regained power in France, immediately they mobilized their military and went to the continent as well to meet Napoleon's army. All right, so they met Napoleon's army at the village of Waterloo. Waterloo. So this was probably the most famous battle that Napoleon ever fought because this was the end for him, his loss at Waterloo. So after a very hard-fought battle, Napoleon was defeated for the last time. Okay, this forced Napoleon to surrender again and to give up his throne again. All right, so it is difficult enough for him to do it the first time, but now he has to do it again 1 year later because he tried to take power again. So Napoleon was exiled again. Why they didn't kill him at this point, I don't know. But they exiled him again, but instead of exiling him to Elba in the Mediterranean Sea, they exiled him far, far away to the island of St. Helena, which is a remote island in the South Atlantic, much farther away than Elba. That way he couldn't return again. And Napoleon Bonaparte, he died in 1821. Okay, thus ends the saga of Napoleon Bonaparte. Okay, so next class we're going to talk about Europe after Napoleon, how Europe kind of bounced back and recovered after Napoleon's 15 years or so in power. And let me know if you have any questions about Napoleon Bonaparte.